Power has a peculiar way of blinding those who abuse it. It whispers seductive lies into the ears of small men, convincing them that the authority they wield is absolute, that the uniform they wear makes them untouchable, that the badge pinned to their chest grants them dominion over the lives of others. Power, when corrupted, becomes a toxin that rots the soul from the inside out, leaving behind nothing but arrogance. And the dangerous delusion of invincibility. Officer Derek Stanfield believed he was invincible. For 16 years he had patrolled the pristine streets of Ridgewood, Oregon, a wealthy suburban enclave nestled in the shadow of the Pacific Northwest's towering evergreens. The town was a picture of American prosperity, manicured lawns that rolled like green velvet toward white picket fences, European luxury sedans gleaming in curved driveways, children riding bicycles down tree-lined avenues while golden retrievers bounded alongside them. It was the kind of place where property values never dropped, and problems were expected to stay on the other side of the county line. Derek Stanfield considered himself the gatekeeper of this paradise. He was 44 years old, thick through the shoulders and soft through the middle, with a buzz cut that had begun its inevitable retreat toward the crown of his skull. His eyes were small and perpetually narrowed, always scanning, always searching for a reason to be angry. He wore his uniform tight, the fabric straining against a chest that hadn't seen the inside of a gym in nearly a decade. But what he lacked in physical discipline, he compensated for with attitude. Pure, undiluted, weaponized attitude. In the Ridgewood Police Department, Stanfield had built a reputation that preceded him like a dark cloud rolling over the mountains. The other officers called him the Hammer, a nickname he had cultivated carefully and wore with grotesque pride. Hammers, after all, crushed things. Hammers made problems go away. Hammers didn't ask questions or worry about paperwork or concern themselves with the constitutional niceties that academy instructors droned on about in their air-conditioned classrooms. His personnel file told a different story than the one Stanfield told himself. Buried within the bureaucratic folders of the department's Human Resources Office were 14 separate citizen complaints spanning his 16-year career. Excessive force, racial profiling, unlawful detention, verbal abuse, threats. The complaints painted a portrait of a man who viewed his badge not as a symbol of public service, but as a license, a permission slip to indulge his worst impulses without fear of consequence. And for 16 years there had been no consequences. Every complaint had been quietly dismissed, settled behind closed doors, or simply buried beneath mountains of procedural paperwork. The police union protected its own with the ferocity of a mother bear defending her cubs, regardless of whether those cubs deserved protection. The precinct captain valued arrest statistics and low-profile operations over civil rights, and Stanfield delivered both with ruthless efficiency. He knew where the boundaries were, and more importantly, he knew exactly how far he could push past them without triggering the kind of attention that ended careers. Derek Stanfield believed with absolute certainty that his badge made him untouchable in Ridgewood. He was catastrophically wrong. On a crisp Tuesday morning in late May, with the sun climbing over the Cascade foothills and casting long golden shadows across the awakening streets, Officer Derek Stanfield would make the single greatest mistake of his entire miserable life. He would not profile an ordinary citizen. He would not harass a helpless victim with no recourse to justice. He would not add another quiet complaint to the growing stack in his personnel file. No. On this particular morning, Derek Stanfield would approach a legally parked sedan, demand identification from a man peacefully drinking coffee. And when that man fell to tremble at the mere presence of the Ridgewood badge, Stanfield would assault him, handcuff him, and haul him to the precinct on fabricated charges. The man in the grey hoodie would not fight back. He would not resist. He would comply with every unlawful order while calmly documenting every violation, every lie, every abuse. Because the man in the grey hoodie was not some random citizen passing through town. He was Deputy Director Marcus Webb of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Security Branch, one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the entire United States government. A man who commanded thousands of federal agents. A man who sat in classified briefings at the White House. A man who had spent 3 decades hunting terrorists, dismantling criminal enterprises, and bringing corrupt officials to justice. A man who briefed the President of the United States every Tuesday morning, within 20 minutes of Marcus Webb making a single phone call from the precinct's booking area. A fleet of black armored SUVs would surround the Ridgewood Police Department. Within 20 hours, Derek Stanfield's badge and gun would be stripped from him in front of his fellow officers. Within 6 months, he would be standing before a federal judge, wearing an orange jumpsuit and transport chains, listening to a sentence that would keep him behind bars until he was nearly 70 years old. This is not merely a story about a racist cop who picked the wrong target. This is a masterclass in how arrogance destroys itself, how corruption eventually consumes its host, and how justice, true justice, sometimes arrives not with a whisper, but with a fleet of black SUVs and the deafening crash of shattered glass. Buckle up! 600 miles to the southeast, 36 hours before the confrontation that would reshape multiple lives, Deputy Director Marcus Webb sat in a secure conference room on the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. The room hummed with tension. Banks of monitors displayed real-time satellite feeds, intercepted communications, and tactical maps covered in colored pins and cryptic annotations. 17 people sat around the massive oak table. Analysts, field coordinators, cybersecurity specialists, representatives from 4 different federal agencies. At the head of the table, Marcus Webb presided over the controlled chaos, like a conductor guiding an orchestra through its most complex symphony. For 72 consecutive hours, Marcus had coordinated Operation Blackout, a multi-agency takedown of a domestic cyber-terrorism ring that had infiltrated critical infrastructure across 11 states. The suspects had planted malicious code in power grid systems, water treatment facilities, hospital networks, threatening to unleash coordinated chaos unless the federal government met their demands. It was the kind of threat that kept intelligence officials awake at night, the kind of attack that could cripple a nation. But Marcus Webb did not panic. He never panicked. Through those 72 hours, he had consumed countless cups of black coffee, catnapped on the couch in his office when exhaustion finally demanded tribute, and methodically dismantled the threat piece by piece. 14 arrests across 6 states, all malicious code identified and neutralized, 0 casualties, complete operational success. Now, as the sun rose over the Potomac River and painted the monuments in shades of amber and rose, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The operation was over. The country was safe, at least from this particular threat. And for the first time in nearly a week, Marcus Webb had somewhere else to be. His secure phone buzzed, a text from a number he knew by heart. "Uncle M can't wait to see you tomorrow. Don't forget the embarrassing cheering you promised. Love you." A rare smile crossed Marcus's weathered face. The message was from Destiny, his sister Patricia's daughter. A bright and ambitious 18-year-old who was graduating from high school in 2 days. Marcus had promised to be there. He had missed too many birthdays, too many holidays, too many ordinary Tuesday dinners over the course of his 30-year career. He would not miss this. In the trunk of his rental car, already reserved and waiting at Portland International Airport, sat a carefully wrapped gift. A leather-bound journal with Destiny's initials embossed on the cover. His niece wanted to be a writer someday, and Marcus believed that every writer needed a proper journal. Something substantial and elegant. Something that would make the act of putting words to paper feel important. He had also ordered a congratulations banner. The kind with silver and gold letters that would catch the light when unfurled. Patricia had warned him that Destiny would be embarrassed. Marcus had responded that embarrassing his niece was precisely the point of being an uncle. For 72 hours, Marcus had been Deputy Director Webb, architect of Operation Blackout, guardian of national security. Now he wanted to be Uncle Marcus. He wanted to sit in uncomfortable folding chairs on a high school football field, watching teenagers in caps and gowns collect their diplomas. He wanted to cheer too loudly when Destiny's name was called, wanted to see her roll her eyes and try to hide her smile. He wanted to eat overcooked barbecue at Patricia's house, wanted to listen to mundane stories about neighborhood gossip and home renovation projects. He wanted for just a few days to be a normal person with a normal family doing normal things. The following morning, Marcus caught the earliest flight to Portland. He slept through most of the journey, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated exhaustion of the operation. When he landed, he collected his rental car, a dark blue sedan, practical and unassuming, and began the 2-hour drive toward Ridgewood, where Patricia had recently relocated after her husband's job transfer. The Pacific Northwest greeted him with its characteristic beauty. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still dusted with late-season snow. Evergreen forests blanketed the hillsides, interrupted only by the occasional meadow or sparkling river. The air that rushed through his cracked window was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and the promise of rain. Marcus drove in comfortable silence, appreciating the absence of urgent phone calls and crisis briefings. His FBI credentials rested in the inner pocket of his jacket, a habit so ingrained that he felt naked without them. But today he had chosen his appearance carefully. Faded grey hoodie soft from years of washing, dark baseball cap pulled low over his brow, simple jeans and worn running shoes. He looked like any other middle-aged man on a cross-country drive. Perhaps a professor on sabbatical, perhaps a divorced dad on his way to visit family. The disguise, if you could call it that, was deliberate. Marcus had learned long ago that anonymity was a precious commodity. In his position, every public appearance carried risk. He had testified before Congress on classified matters. He had been photographed shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers. His face was not widely known to the general public. But within certain circles, criminal circles, terrorist circles, the circles of those who had been brought to justice by his efforts, Marcus Webb was a name that inspired hatred. So when he traveled for personal reasons, he dressed down. He drove rental cars with out-of-state plates. He avoided using his credentials unless absolutely necessary. He became for a few precious hours or days invisible. That invisibility had protected him for years. This morning it would nearly destroy him. And ultimately it would destroy those who mistook his humility for weakness. Around 9 in the morning, Marcus spotted a small artisanal coffee shop on the main commercial strip of Ridgewood. The sign read Evergreen Roasters in hand-painted letters, and the parking spots along the curb were mostly empty. His stomach reminded him that he had skipped breakfast, and the thought of a decent espresso before completing the final leg of his journey was too tempting to resist. He parked legally in a 2-hour spot, cut the engine, and walked into the shop. The interior was exactly what he expected from an upscale suburban cafe. Exposed brick walls, reclaimed wood countertops, a chalkboard menu listing drinks with names like Cascadian Mist and Pacific Roast. The barista was a friendly young woman with a nose ring and an encyclopedic knowledge of single-origin beans. Marcus ordered a macchiato, overpriced but excellent, and declined the offer of a pastry. He carried his drink back to his car, settled into the driver's seat, and decided to take a few minutes to review some unclassified briefings on his tablet before continuing on to Patricia's house. The sun warmed his face through the windshield. The espresso was rich and perfectly extracted. The street was quiet, peaceful, utterly ordinary. A golden retriever trotted past on a leash, followed by a woman in yoga pants pushing an expensive stroller. A landscaping truck rumbled by its bed, loaded with mulch and flowering plants. Marcus savored the moment. These pockets of normalcy were rare in his life, and he had learned to appreciate them when they appeared. He did not know that 3 blocks away a police cruiser was beginning its morning patrol. He did not know that within the next 15 minutes his quiet morning would be violently interrupted by flashing lights and unfounded accusations. And he certainly did not know that by the end of this day, he would be responsible for the complete dismantling of the Ridgewood Police Department. The Ridgewood patrol cruiser rolled down Elmwood Avenue with the unhurried arrogance of a predator surveying its territory. Behind the wheel, Officer Derek Stanfield drummed his thick fingers against the leather steering wheel, scanning the storefronts and sidewalks with narrowed eyes. The morning had been quiet, too quiet. No traffic violations to pursue, no vagrancy complaints to investigate, no opportunities to remind the citizens of Ridgewood exactly who kept their precious streets safe. Derek hated quiet mornings. Quiet meant boredom. Quiet meant no numbers to add to his monthly activity report, and most importantly, quiet meant he wasn't needed, which was intolerable to a man whose entire sense of self-worth derived from exercising power over others. In the passenger seat, Officer Tyler Marsh gripped his regulation notepad and tried very hard to disappear. Tyler was 24 years old, barely 6 months out of the police academy, and already questioning every decision that had led him to this particular cruiser on this particular morning. He had joined the force with genuine idealism, the kind of earnest, uncomplicated belief that police officers were heroes who protected communities and helped people in crisis. His father had been a firefighter. His grandfather had served in the army. Public service ran through Tyler's veins like a second bloodstream. But 6 months of shadowing Derek Stanfield had corroded that idealism like acid eating through metal. Tyler had watched Stanfield fabricate probable cause for traffic stops, targeting vehicles with out-of-state plates. He had witnessed unnecessary force applied to suspects who offered no resistance. He had heard the casual racism, the demeaning comments, the crude jokes that his training officer made when he thought no one important was listening. And worst of all, Tyler had remained silent through all of it, paralyzed by the very culture that the academy had warned him about, but failed to prepare him to confront. The blue wall of silence was not a concept Tyler had truly understood until he lived within it. Now he understood it intimately. The pressure to conform, to look the other way, to protect a fellow officer regardless of his conduct. It was overwhelming. Speaking up meant career suicide. It meant being labeled a rat, being frozen out by colleagues, being assigned to the worst shifts and the most dangerous calls until you either quit or broke. Tyler had convinced himself that survival required patience. He would complete his probationary period under Stanfield, transfer to a different unit, and build the kind of career he had originally envisioned. He would be one of the good ones. He just had to get through the next 6 months without incident. But deep down, Tyler knew the truth. His silence was not strategic patience. It was cowardice. And every time Stanfield crossed a line while Tyler watched, a piece of his soul crumbled away. "Hey, rookie!" Stanfield's gravelly voice cut through Tyler's spiraling thoughts. "Look at this." Stanfield slowed the cruiser to a crawl, his head turning towards something that had caught his attention. Tyler leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "Look at what the coffee shop, not the shop, rookie!" Stanfield's voice dropped into a register that Tyler had learned to recognize. Low, predatory, almost hungry. The curb. Tyler followed his training officer's gaze to a dark blue sedan parked legally along the street. The vehicle was unremarkable in every way. A standard rental model. Clean but not flashy. The kind of car that business travelers selected from airport counters across the country. Sitting in the driver's seat with the window partially lowered was a black man in his early 50s. He wore a faded grey hoodie and a dark baseball cap. In one hand he held a small paper cup of coffee. With the other he scrolled methodically through a tablet. The man was not playing loud music. He was not looking around nervously. He was not blocking traffic or disturbing the peace or doing anything that any reasonable observer would consider suspicious. He was simply sitting in his legally parked car, quietly enjoying the morning, existing in a public space in a manner that harmed no one. But to Derek Stanfield, the man's mere presence was a glaring anomaly. "Out-of-state plates," Stanfield noted, his voice dropping even lower. "Virginia, long way from home." "Maybe he's visiting family," Tyler offered weakly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth even as he spoke them. "There's a graduation ceremony at the high school this weekend. Lots of out-of-towners in the area." Stanfield ignored him completely. Sitting there for God knows how long. Casing the joint probably, looking for opportunities. He snorted derisively. "Doesn't belong in the zip code, that's for damn sure." Tyler's stomach tightened. He recognized the pattern. He had seen it play out a dozen times over the past 6 months. Stanfield would find some pretextual justification for a stop, exercise his authority with maximum aggression, and either extract a minor citation or simply terrorize the driver into submission before letting them go with a warning and a threat. It was street theater, a performance designed to remind certain people that they were not welcome in Ridgewood. The certain people were always the same. They were always black, or brown, or somehow different from the affluent white residents who populated the neighborhood. They were always vulnerable, travelers without local connections, workers passing through, people who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back against police overreach. "Sir, he's just drinking coffee. The shop just opened a few minutes ago. Maybe he's taking a break before continuing a drive." Stanfield's head snapped toward Tyler. His small eyes filled with contempt. "You're naive, Hale. Green as grass and twice as soft." He jerked the steering wheel, pulling the cruiser up directly behind the blue sedan with deliberate aggression. "You want to make it in this job, you learn to see what's really happening on these streets. People who look like that dressing like a thug in a neighborhood where houses cost $3 million. He paused. "They're up to something. Always." Stanfield hit the switch for the emergency lights. The red and blue strobes exploded into life, shattering the peaceful morning ambiance, reflecting off every window within 100 yards. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming, designed not to quietly alert a driver to pull over, but to announce police presence with maximum intimidation. Tyler watched the man in the sedan. Through the rear window of the patrol car, he could see the man's head turn slightly toward the rearview mirror, acknowledging the lights behind him. But he did not flinch. He did not scramble for his wallet. He did not exhibit any of the nervous behaviors that guilty people typically displayed when confronted by law enforcement. He simply sat there, calm and composed, as if flashing police lights behind his vehicle were a minor inconvenience rather than a life-altering threat. Something about that composure made Tyler deeply uneasy. "Let's go see what our friend is hiding," Stanfield said, a crooked smile spreading across his face as he opened his door. Tyler hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough to whisper a silent prayer for a quiet, uneventful encounter, before following his training officer out of the cruiser. He had no idea that he was about to become an accessory to the kidnapping of one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the entire federal government. In the driver's seat of the blue sedan, Marcus Webb let out a slow, controlled breath as the flashing lights filled his rearview mirror. His hands remained exactly where they were, both resting visibly on the top of the steering wheel, fingers relaxed but clearly empty. His tablet, which had been displaying an unclassified summary of recent infrastructure security initiatives, went dark as he pressed the power button with his thumb and slid it onto the passenger seat. His paper cup of coffee found its way into the cup holder with practiced economy of motion. These were not the movements of a frightened man. They were the movements of someone who had been through situations like this before. Someone who understood exactly how dangerous a routine traffic stop could become and had developed protocols for minimizing risk. Marcus watched in his side mirror as the heavy-set patrol officer stepped out of the cruiser. He noted the aggressive posture immediately, the wide-legged stance, the hand resting casually but deliberately on the butt of the service weapon, the swagger that radiated unearned confidence. Behind the first officer, a much younger man emerged from the passenger side, moving with considerably less certainty. Two officers, senior and rookie, the senior clearly in command. Marcus's highly trained eyes caught every micro-expression, every telling detail in the approaching officer's body language. The flushed color rising up the neck, the narrowed eyes that scanned Marcus not as a potential threat to be assessed, but as prey to be dominated. The slight curl at the corner of the lip that suggested pleasure rather than professional duty. This was not a routine traffic stop. This was not an officer investigating a genuine concern. This was a predator approaching what he believed to be vulnerable prey. Marcus had spent 30 years in federal law enforcement. He had interrogated terrorist suspects, debriefed defectors from hostile intelligence services, and read the body language of some of the most dangerous criminals on earth. He recognized this particular swagger instantly. The swagger of a man who believed his badge granted him absolute immunity from consequence. The swagger of a bully who had never encountered resistance he couldn't overwhelm. A familiar cold fury began to build in Marcus's chest, but he suppressed it ruthlessly. Emotion was a liability in situations like this. Control was everything. The smart play was obvious. Marcus could reach into his inner jacket pocket, extract his FBI credentials, flash the gold badge and the identification card that declared him Deputy Director of the National Security Branch. The confrontation would end immediately. The officer would stumble over his apologies, suddenly remember an urgent call on the other side of town, and disappear in a cloud of embarrassed retreat. But even as Marcus considered this option, something else was taking shape in his mind. A question, really. If this officer was doing this to him, a well-dressed middle-aged man sitting quietly in a legally parked car drinking coffee, what was he doing to young people? What was he doing to teenagers who drove through this town on their way to somewhere else? What was he doing to parents picking up children from school, to workers reporting for early shifts, to anyone who didn't have a gold badge in their pocket to protect them? What was this officer doing to people who had no power to fight back? The question burned in Marcus's mind, and in that moment he made a decision. He would not reveal his identity. He would let this officer dig his own grave. "Morning!" The senior officer barked as he reached the driver's side window. The word was technically a greeting, but the tone stripped it of any warmth. It was a command, not a courtesy. The officer leaned in close, deliberately invading Marcus's personal space, close enough that Marcus could smell the coffee on his breath and the aggressive aftershave that didn't quite mask the sour undertone of nervous sweat. It was a classic intimidation technique. Violate personal boundaries, establish physical dominance, trigger the primal fear response that made most people compliant. Marcus did not flinch. He turned his head slowly, meeting the officer's eyes with an expression that was carefully, deliberately unreadable. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem? Was I parked illegally?" "I asked the questions," the officer snapped, clearly annoyed that his target was not immediately trembling or fumbling over his words. Most people, when confronted with flashing lights and an aggressive cop, became anxious, deferential, eager to please. This man's composure was an insult, a challenge to the natural order of things. License and registration, right now. Marcus noted the absence of any explanation for the stop. No, I pulled you over because... No stated reason for the detention. This was already well outside proper procedure, and Marcus began mentally cataloguing the violations. I'm perfectly willing to provide my identification, officer. However, as I'm parked legally and my engine is off, I'm simply inquiring as to the reasonable articulable suspicion for this detainment. He paused. Are you investigating a specific crime? The question hung in the morning air like a grenade with the pin pulled. From his position near the passenger side of the sedan, the young rookie officer swallowed hard. Marcus caught the movement in his peripheral vision and noted the expression on the young man's face. Recognition, dread, and something that looked remarkably like shame. The rookie knew. He knew that his training officer was operating outside the law. He knew that the question Marcus had just asked was precisely the question that every citizen had the right to ask, and that his partner had no legitimate answer. The rookie's pale face told Marcus everything he needed to know about the dynamic inside that patrol car, and the culture that enabled officers like this one to operate unchecked. The senior officer's face flushed a deep, ugly red. His jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. To Officer Derek Stanfield. Marcus had glimpsed the nameplate on his uniform. A black man asking about constitutional rights was not merely an inconvenience. It was the ultimate insult. It was a direct challenge to his authority. A refusal to play the submissive role that Stanfield expected, demanded, required. You want suspicion, Stanfield sneered, leaning even closer. His breath was hot and unpleasant against Marcus's face. My suspicion is that there's been a rash of burglaries in this area, and you fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. It was a blatant lie. Marcus recognized it instantly. His training in interrogation and deception detection, refined over 3 decades of interviewing criminals, terrorists, and double agents, allowed him to read the telltale signs as clearly as printed text. The slight dilation of the pupils, the microtension around the mouth, the infinitesimal shift in vocal pitch that accompanied fabrication. More importantly, Marcus's briefings on the Pacific Northwest region had included no mention of any burglary spree in suburban Oregon, and the FBI would certainly have been notified if such a pattern existed near a major metropolitan area. There had been no burglaries in Ridgewood. Officer Stanfield had invented the entire premise on the spot. I see, Marcus said evenly. He made a decision in that moment. A calculated risk that would either expose the full depth of this officer's corruption or diffuse the situation entirely. He reached slowly toward the center console, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and pulled out the rental agreement for his vehicle. Then with equal care he reached into his back pocket and extracted his civilian leather wallet. The one that contained his Virginia driver's license and a few credit cards. The one he used when traveling incognito. He deliberately bypassed the inner breast pocket of his jacket. The pocket where his heavy gold FBI credentials rested. Waiting, a part of Marcus, the tired uncle who just wanted to get to his niece's graduation, whispered that this was foolish. One flash of the badge and this entire unpleasant encounter would evaporate like morning mist. He could be on his way to Patricia's house within minutes. The coffee shop receding in his rearview mirror. This aggressive cop reduced to a minor footnote in an otherwise pleasant trip. But another part of Marcus, the federal investigator who had dedicated his life to rooting out corruption in all its forms, wanted to see exactly how far this officer was willing to go. If Stanfield was doing this to him, he was absolutely doing it to countless others who lacked the power, the knowledge, or the resources to fight back, people who would accept the humiliation, pay the unjust tickets, and go home to tell their families about the officer who had made them feel like criminals in their own country. Those people deserve justice too. Marcus handed over his Virginia driver's license and the rental agreement, watching Stanfield's face carefully as the officer examined the documents. Marcus Webb. Stanfield read the name aloud, his tone dripping with undisguised disdain. Long way from home. Marcus, what are you doing in Ridgewood? Visiting family. Marcus replied, his voice remaining perfectly level. A pause, then with quiet but unmistakable authority. And my name is Mr. Webb. The correction was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Stanfield's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, his already reddened face darkening another shade toward purple. In the officer's limited worldview, first-name basis was a tool of dominance, a way of stripping dignity from suspects, reminding them who held the power. For this black man in a hoodie to insist on formal address was an act of defiance so intolerable that Stanfield's entire body seemed to vibrate with suppressed fury. The rookie officer Tyler, according to his nameplate, had drifted toward the passenger side of the sedan, presumably to maintain a tactical position on the vehicle's blind spot. But Marcus could see the young man's reflection in the side mirror. And what he saw was not tactical awareness. It was barely concealed horror. Tyler Marsh knew what was about to happen. He had seen this script play out before. And based on the pallor of his face and the white knuckle grip on his department-issued notepad, he wanted no part of it. "Step out of the vehicle," Stanfield commanded, his voice dropping to a register that was clearly intended to intimidate. Marcus remained motionless for a long moment, his hands still visible on the steering wheel. He was mapping the officer's psychological state, calculating the escalation trajectory, determining precisely how to respond in a way that would document the maximum number of civil rights violations while minimizing the risk of physical harm. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice maintaining that infuriatingly steady cadence that seemed to drive Stanfield toward the edge of control. "You have my identification, you have my rental agreement. I am not a flight risk and I am clearly not a threat. Ordering me out of the vehicle escalates a situation that requires no escalation." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I ask you again, what specific crime do you suspect me of committing?" From behind Marcus's sedan, Tyler's voice drifted across the morning air, thin and uncertain. Officer Stanfield, we got the ID, he's clear, let's just run it through dispatch and go." Stanfield whirled toward his rookie partner, his face contorted with barely contained rage. "Shut up, Hale, I'm handling this." He turned back to Marcus, jabbing a thick finger toward the driver's side window. "I told you to step out of the vehicle, now. Are you refusing a lawful order?" "I'm requesting clarification of the legal basis for this detention," Marcus replied calmly, "as is my constitutional right under the Fourth Amendment. I have complied with your request for identification. I have answered your questions about my presence in this town." He paused. "At this point, officer, unless you have probable cause to arrest me for a specific crime, I believe I am entitled to continue my journey." The words were precise, measured, and devastating. They were also, Marcus knew, exactly the kind of words that would push an officer like Derek Stanfield completely over the edge. Stanfield stepped back from the window, his hand dropping from his service weapon to unsnap the retention strap on his holster. The threat was explicit, unmistakable, designed to terrify. The morning sun glinted off the exposed metal of the gun grip. "Refusal to obey a lawful order," Stanfield announced loudly, clearly performing for whatever audience might be listening. Perhaps dispatch, perhaps passers-by, perhaps simply his own ego. "Get out of the damn car before I pull you out." Marcus looked at the officer's hand hovering over the weapon. He calculated the variables with the cold precision of a man who had spent 30 years navigating dangerous situations. He was a high-level federal agent, yes, but right now in this moment he was also a black man in a hoodie facing down an armed, unstable local cop. His credentials were hidden. His backup was 600 miles away in Washington. The only witness was a terrified rookie who clearly lacked the courage to intervene. If Marcus resisted, even verbally, even legally, there was a non-zero probability that this encounter would end in violence. Officers like Stanfield did not respond well to challenges. They escalated. They justified. They wrote reports that transformed their victims into aggressors. The safest play was compliance, followed by devastating legal retribution. "All right," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying a note of resignation that was entirely performative. "I am stepping out of the vehicle. Slowly, my hands will remain visible at all times." He opened the door with deliberate care, placing both palms flat against the frame where Stanfield could see them. He rose from the seat, unfolding his full height with a controlled grace that belied his 52 years. Standing Marcus was slightly taller than Stanfield, 6'2", with a broad athletic build maintained by the strict fitness standards of the Bureau. His posture was impeccable, shoulders back, chin level, projecting an unconscious authority that came from decades of commanding rooms full of powerful people. Stanfield felt that authority immediately, and it threatened him. The officer's response was as predictable as it was brutal. Without warning, Stanfield grabbed Marcus roughly by the shoulder and spun him around. The motion was violent, unnecessary, designed not for safety but for humiliation. before Marcus could adjust his footing, Stanfield slammed him face first against the side of the blue sedan. Marcus's jaw hit the cold metal of the car's roof with enough force to rattle his teeth. Pain flared through his cheekbone. The world narrowed to immediate sensory data, the metallic tang of blood where he'd bitten the inside of his lip, the pressure of Stanfield's forearm against the back of his neck, the rough texture of the car's paint against his palms. "Hands on the roof! Spread your legs, now!" Stanfield yelled. Marcus complied. His body moved automatically, assuming the position that countless suspects had assumed before him. His trained mind observing the situation from a strange remove, even as his muscles obeyed the officer's commands. He spread his arms across the roof of the sedan. He widened his stance until his ankles were nearly 2 feet apart, and when Stanfield kicked his right ankle even farther, forcing him into an uncomfortable and degrading position, Marcus gritted his teeth and said nothing. "Officer Hale!" Marcus spoke loudly, ensuring his voice would carry to the rookie standing frozen on the other side of the vehicle. "I want you to note that I am fully compliant. I am offering 0 physical resistance. Your partner has just initiated a physical assault without probable cause. I am documenting this verbally for any recording devices that may be present." "Shut your mouth," Stanfield snarled, beginning a rough invasive pat-down. The officer's hands moved with aggressive carelessness, more interested in dominance than in actual safety screening. He patted down Marcus's legs, grabbed his waist, ran his palms along the outside of the grey hoodie with the kind of violation that crossed every line of professional conduct. He felt the civilian wallet in Marcus's back pocket and ignored it. He had already seen that identification, but crucially, fatally, Stanfield failed to properly search the inner breast pocket of the jacket Marcus wore beneath his hoodie. His technique was sloppy. His attention divided between the physical search and his own swelling anger. The heavy leather bifold containing Marcus's FBI credentials remained undetected, pressed against his ribs like a hidden weapon waiting to be deployed. "You got any weapons on you, Needles? Anything that's going to stick me?" Stanfield demanded, pressing his forearm harder against the back of Marcus's neck. "I have no weapons." Marcus stated, his voice flat and controlled despite the pressure on his spine. "And you are currently applying excessive force to a compliant subject. I'm also documenting that for the record." Stanfield's response was a wordless sound of contempt, something between a snort and a growl. "I'll show you excessive force, you arrogant." He trailed off, perhaps remembering at the last moment that there might be witnesses, might be cameras, might be consequences for whatever slur had been rising in his throat. Instead, he grabbed Marcus's arms and wrenched them behind his back with unnecessary roughness. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of handcuffs echoed through the quiet morning street. Click, click, click. Stanfield tightened the cuffs several notches past what was necessary, ensuring that the steel bit painfully into Marcus's wrists. The circulation in his hands began to diminish almost immediately, a tingling numbness spreading through his fingers. "Sir!" Tyler Marsh's voice came from behind the car, thin and frightened. "Sir, what exactly are we arresting him for?" Stanfield spun Marcus around to face him, gripping the front of his hoodie with one meaty fist. The officer's face was inches from Marcus's, close enough that Marcus could count the broken capillaries in his reddened cheeks, could smell the sour, fierce sweat beneath the aggressive aftershave. "Disorderly conduct." Stanfield recited the fabricated charges, rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Resisting arrest, failure to comply with a lawful order." He smiled, an ugly, triumphant expression that revealed yellowing teeth. "That's how you build a case, rookie. Learn from it." He shoved Marcus toward the waiting patrol cruiser, his hand pressing against the back of Marcus's head to force him into the rear seat. The motion was rougher than necessary, and Marcus stumbled, unable to use his cuffed hands to catch himself. He half fell, half sat into the cramped plastic compartment of the cruiser's back seat, his bound arms trapped painfully beneath his weight. Stanfield slammed the door with a sound like a gunshot. Through the wire mesh that separated the rear compartment from the front seats, Marcus watched Stanfield turn to his rookie partner with an expression of grotesque satisfaction. "See, Hale, that's how you handle these types. You show them who the alpha is right from the start. You establish dominance. They back down every time." Marcus said nothing. He had managed to sit himself upright despite the awkward position of his cuffed hands. His expression was not that of a man who had backed down. His eyes, fixed straight ahead through the windshield, held no fear, no anxiety, no submission. They held only patience. The patience of a man who understood that some debts took time to collect, but were always collected in full. Tyler Marsh looked through the wire mesh at the man in the back seat. Something about the prisoner's stillness, his composure, his absolute refusal to display any of the emotions that an innocent man wrongfully arrested should be displaying. Something about it made the young officer profoundly uneasy. This man did not look defeated. He looked like someone waiting for a timer to reach 0. The patrol cruiser pulled away from Elmwood Avenue, leaving Marcus's rental sedan sitting alone by the curb like an abandoned piece of evidence. For 10 minutes, the cruiser rolled through the pristine streets of Ridgewood, past the boutique shops and the organic grocery stores and the yoga studios that catered to the town's affluent residents. The route to the police precinct took them through the heart of the community that Derek Stanfield considered his personal kingdom. And for those 10 minutes, Stanfield talked. He talked from the front seat with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just proven a point, his voice carrying through the steel mesh with a quality that was equal parts lecture and victory lap. "You guys always think you're so smart." Stanfield mocked, glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "With your articulable suspicion garbage and your constitutional rights nonsense. Watch a couple of YouTube videos, read a few social media posts, and suddenly you're constitutional lawyers who know better than real police officers." Marcus remained silent. His gaze was fixed on the passing scenery. Expensive boutiques, tree-lined streets, joggers in designer athletic wear. But his mind was elsewhere. He was memorizing badge numbers, patrol car numbers, street names, a precise timeline of events that would become the foundation of multiple federal charges. "Well, let me tell you something about the real world." Stanfield continued, warming to his theme. "Out here on these streets, the badge makes the rules. Not some law school professor, not some activist with a smartphone. The badge." He paused for emphasis. "And in my town, you don't talk back to the badge." Tyler Marsh gripped the passenger door handle with white-knuckled intensity, staring out the window as if the passing storefronts contained the answers to all of life's difficult questions. He wanted to be anywhere else. He wanted to be back at the academy, where the instructors had talked about community policing and de-escalation and the sacred trust between law enforcement and the citizens they served. He wanted to rewind the past 6 months and choose a different training officer, a different department, a different career entirely, but he was here, and he was silent. And his silence made him complicit in everything that had just happened, and everything that was about to happen. "Not so chatty now, are we?" Stanfield taunted, his eyes flickering to the rearview mirror again. "Where's all that smart talk now, Mr. Webb? Where's your constitutional rights when you're sitting in the cage where you belong?" Marcus did not respond. He did not rise to the bait. He simply continued memorizing, cataloging, preparing. Tyler finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Derek, Officer Stanfield, maybe we should just write him a citation for whatever and let him go at the station. We don't have body cam footage of him casing anything. We don't have any evidence of We don't need body cams to prove he was being combative." Stanfield cut him off, his voice dripping with condescension. "My word is gold with the captain rookie. It's called professional courtesy. Maybe you'll learn about that when you've been on the force for more than 5 minutes. The cruiser turned onto the access road that led to the Ridgewood Police Department, a modern brick and glass building that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a police station. The architecture was deliberately welcoming, designed by expensive consultants to project an image of community partnership and transparent governance. The reality inside was something else entirely. Stanfield parked the cruiser in the secure lot behind the building and hauled Marcus out of the back seat by his chained arms. The motion sent sharp pains shooting through Marcus's shoulders, but he suppressed any visible reaction. He would not give this officer the satisfaction. The booking area was standard for a small suburban department. A row of plastic chairs against one wall, a high counter staffed by a desk sergeant, several desks with computer terminals where officers filled out paperwork. Phones rang with moderate frequency. A water cooler gurgled in the corner. The smell of stale coffee hung in the recycled air like a permanent fixture. Stanfield marched Marcus up to the booking counter with the swagger of a hunter presenting a trophy. The desk sergeant looked up from his computer screen. His nameplate read Sergeant Patterson, and everything about him suggested a man counting down the days to retirement. He was heavy-set and grey-haired. with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and an expression of perpetual weariness that came from decades of processing human misery across this very counter. "Morning, Stanfield, what do we have here?" Patterson asked, pulling a blank booking sheet toward him. "Got a live one, Sarge," Stanfield said loudly, puffing out his chest. "Marcus Webb, Virginia driver's license. That's a long way from home. Found him casing the businesses on Elmwood. Refused to provide ID initially. Got combative. Refused a lawful order. And physically resisted detention." Marcus listened to the string of lies pouring out of Stanfield's mouth with clinical detachment. Every word was perjury. Every accusation was fabricated. And every statement was being seared into Marcus's memory for future reference. Tyler Marsh stood a few feet away, his face pale as chalk, staring at the linoleum floor as if he could will himself to sink through it. He said nothing. He did nothing. He simply existed in that space like a ghost, present but powerless. Sergeant Patterson sighed, picking up a pen. "Any injuries to officers?" "No, I handled him," Stanfield bragged. Patterson looked at Marcus. "All right, Mr. Webb, we're going to inventory your personal property, take your fingerprints, and place you in a holding cell. You'll see a magistrate in the morning." Marcus looked directly at the desk sergeant. His voice, when he finally spoke, was so calm, so utterly devoid of the usual panic or anger seen in arrested individuals, that it made Patterson pause. "Sergeant Patterson," Marcus said clearly, ensuring his voice carried across the quiet booking area. "I'm formally notifying you that Officer Stanfield has just filed a false verbal report. I was sitting in my legally parked vehicle drinking coffee. I provided my identification immediately upon request. I was ordered out of my vehicle without probable cause, assaulted, and arrested without any legitimate legal basis." He paused, letting the words settle. "I formally request that you secure all dashcam footage from Officer Stanfield's vehicle immediately, before it is accidentally lost, corrupted, or deleted." The booking area went silent. 2 officers at nearby desks stopped typing, their fingers frozen above their keyboards. A phone rang and went unanswered. The water cooler's gurgle seemed to grow louder in the absence of any other sound. Stanfield stepped forward, pointing a finger in Marcus's face. "You shut your mouth. You're a criminal sitting in my jail. You don't make demands here. You don't give orders. You're nobody." But Sergeant Patterson was frowning now, looking from the furious Stanfield to the unnervingly calm Marcus and back again. He had processed thousands of suspects over his long career. He had seen every flavor of criminal behavior, from blubbering confessions to violent resistance to sullen silence. He had never seen anything quite like this. This man was not acting like a criminal. This man was acting like a federal prosecutor dictating a legal memorandum. "Stanfield, calm down," Patterson muttered. He turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Webb, you can argue your case to the judge. Right now, empty your pockets." "My hands are cuffed behind my back," Marcus pointed out reasonably. "Right," Patterson grunted. "Stanfield, uncuff him. Let him empty his pockets, then we'll put him in holding cell 3. Stanfield snatched his keys and roughly unlocked the cuffs. Marcus brought his arms forward slowly, rubbing his bruised wrists. He reached into his pants pockets and placed their contents on the counter. A set of car keys, some loose change, a pack of gum. "Everything," Stanfield ordered. "Jacket pockets too. All of it." Marcus paused. He looked at Stanfield, then at Patterson. "Sergeant, before I empty my jacket pockets, I would like to exercise my right to a phone call immediately." "You get your call after you're booked," Stanfield snapped. "Actually," Patterson corrected, "a stickler for procedure when the room was quiet enough for everyone to hear. He can make a call while I run his prints. Go ahead. Use the wall phone." Marcus walked slowly to the heavy metal phone bolted to the cinder block wall. He picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory. It was not a local number. It was a Washington, D.C. area code. Stanfield leaned against the desk, smirking at Tyler. "Watch this rookie. He's probably calling his mummy to come post bail. Or maybe a public defender who won't even pick up." Marcus stood with his back to the room. The phone rang twice. A sharp voice answered on a highly secure encrypted line at the J. Edgar Hoover building, the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Kane." "Sawyer." Marcus said quietly, his tone shifting instantly from civilian suspect to commanding officer. "It's Marcus." The tone on the other end of the line shifted immediately from professional to respectful. "Director Webb, I thought you were off the grid until Thursday for the graduation. Is everything all right?" There's been a change of plans. Marcus set his eyes scanning the precinct wall. I'm currently standing in the booking area of the Ridgewood Police Department in Oregon. I've encountered a delay. A pause on the line. Sir, are you visiting the local precinct for some reason? No, Sawyer. I am currently under arrest. Another pause. This one heavy with confusion and rising alarm. Marcus could picture his second in command. Special Agent in Charge Sawyer Kane, one of the most capable field commanders in the Bureau. Processing those words and finding them impossible to reconcile with reality. Under arrest, sir, on what charges? Fictitious ones, Marcus replied smoothly. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. The arresting officer is a Derek Stanfield. He's aggressive, legally illiterate, and currently filing a false report. The sound of a chair scraping violently across the floor echoed through the phone line. Director, this is absolutely unacceptable. I'm dispatching the Seattle field office immediately. We'll have the local SAC pull you out of there in 20 minutes. Negative, Sawyer, Marcus commanded softly. Do not extract me, not yet. Sir, if they do this to me, they do this to the citizens of this town every day. This department needs a thorough audit, starting from the command level and working down to every officer on the roster. He paused. Here are my orders. Marcus quietly rattled off a series of instructions. Agent deployment, evidence preservation, media containment, legal coordination. From across the room, Stanfield watched the man whispering into the phone and laughed. Look at him, begging for a bailout. Marcus finished his instructions. Have them assemble outside. Nobody breaches the building until I give the signal. Understood? Understood, Director. We're initiating a Code Alpha response. The Seattle field office rapid deployment team is spinning up as we speak. A pause. God help those local cops, sir. Just get it done, Sawyer. Marcus hung up the phone. He turned back to face the room, his expression revealing nothing. Not satisfaction, not anger, not fear. Simply the blank mask of a man who had set something inevitable into motion and was now simply waiting for the gears to turn. He walked back to the counter where Stanfield and Sergeant Patterson were waiting. Got your lawyer sorted out, Stanfield sneered. I made my arrangements, Marcus replied. Then without haste, he reached into the inner breast pocket of the jacket he wore beneath his grey hoodie. The pocket that Stanfield's sloppy, angry pat-down had failed to discover. Hey, hands where I can see them. Slow. Stanfield barked his hand, dropping to his gun again. Marcus's hand emerged slowly. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding a heavy black leather bifold wallet, substantially different from the civilian wallet he had surrendered earlier. This one was thick, well worn, with the distinctive sheen of high-quality government-issue leather. He tossed it onto the booking counter with a heavy, deliberate thud. The wallet landed directly on top of the blank arrest report that Stanfield was supposed to fill out. The impact was solid enough to make the papers beneath it flutter, and the heavy leather flipped open upon landing, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Ridgewood precinct. Pinned next to a federal identification card bearing Marcus's photograph and a terrifying array of security clearances was a badge, not a local badge, not a state badge, a solid gold badge featuring the eagle seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and beneath it embossed in gold lettering that seemed to glow with terrible authority were the words, Deputy Director, National Security Branch. Sergeant Roy Patterson stopped breathing. His hand, which had been reaching for the booking form, froze in mid-air, as if the muscles had simply forgotten how to function. His eyes locked onto the gold badge lying on his counter, reading the embossed words over and over. His mind rejecting what his eyes were telling him with increasing desperation. Deputy Director, National Security Branch, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This had to be a mistake. This had to be a sophisticated fake. One of those replica badges that criminals sometimes purchased from overseas websites. There was simply no way, no conceivable scenario in which Derek Stanfield, the department's most aggressive patrol officer, had just roughed up, handcuffed, and arrested one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the entire federal government. Patterson looked up at the man in the grey hoodie. The man looked back at him with eyes that had seen things Patterson couldn't imagine. Terrorist plots unraveled, international crime syndicates dismantled, threats to national security neutralized in operations that would never appear in any newspaper. Those eyes held no plea for understanding, no anger at his treatment, no fear of the local officers surrounding him. They held only a cold, patient certainty that was somehow more terrifying than any display of rage could have been. "Stanfield," Patterson whispered, his voice cracking violently over the name. "Stanfield, what have you done?" Officer Derek Stanfield stared at the badge on the counter. His brain, which had been operating on autopilot for the past hour, suddenly encountered information that it was completely unequipped to process. The confident swagger, the dominating posture, the cruel satisfaction of having put another suspicious character in his place. All of it evaporated like morning dew under a blowtorch. For 3 long seconds he simply stood there, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Then desperately he lunged for the only defense his panicked mind could construct. "It's fake!" Stanfield announced, his voice too loud, too aggressive, the words tumbling out with the manic energy of a man trying to convince himself. "Come on, Sarge, look at him. You think the deputy director of the FBI drives a rented Ford sedan and sits around drinking coffee in a hoodie? It's a prop. A Halloween costume badge he bought online. I'm adding impersonating a federal officer to the charges." Marcus did not flinch at the accusation. He reached out with terrifying slowness, picking up the leather bifold wallet from the counter. He flipped it open, turning the identification card towards Sergeant Patterson. "There is a QR code on the back of this credential." Marcus said, his voice dropping the room's temperature by several degrees. "Scan it with your department-issued terminal. It links directly to the Department of Justice verification database, a database I should mention that cannot be accessed by civilians and cannot be fooled by replica badges." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Do it now, Sergeant." Patterson swallowed hard. His hands were shaking visibly as he reached for the barcode scanner attached to his computer terminal. He fumbled it twice before managing to grip it properly, the device trembling in his fingers like a divining rod detecting disaster. He pulled the trigger, sweeping the red laser across the QR code on the back of Marcus's federal identification. The precinct computer chirped. The standard local criminal database that the Ridgewood PD used for routine booking was instantly bypassed. Instead, the screen flickered and resolved into a secure, encrypted federal portal bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. The connection was established through layers of government security that the local system shouldn't have even been able to access. An automatic protocol triggered by the credential's unique authentication signature. A high-resolution photograph of Marcus Webb filled the monitor. It was his official bureau portrait taken 3 years earlier, showing a distinguished man in a dark suit with the American flag draped behind him. The kind of photograph that hung in federal buildings across the country. Below the photograph in bold green text that pulsed with verification confirmation were the words, "Clearance level top secret /SCI. Active. Status Deputy Director, National Security Branch. Flag immediate notification to OIG upon detention." The last line hit Patterson like a physical blow. OIG, the Office of the Inspector General, the internal watchdog of the federal law enforcement community, with the authority to investigate and prosecute misconduct by any agency or official. The system had already flagged this detention. Someone in Washington was already being notified. The cavalry was already coming. Patterson practically collapsed backward into his rolling chair, the barcode scanner dropping from his nerveless fingers and clattering noisily against the linoleum floor. All color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a blue uniform. "It's real," Patterson gasped, looking at Stanfield with a mixture of horror and rapidly mounting rage. "You idiot! You absolute colossal idiot! You just arrested the deputy director of the FBI!" Tyler Marsh, the rookie, slid down the side of a nearby filing cabinet until he was sitting on the floor. His head in his hands, his career was over, his life was over, he was an accessory, an unwilling, terrified, silent accessory, to the kidnapping of a federal executive whose authority exceeded that of everyone in this building combined by orders of magnitude. The magnitude of the disaster was so vast that his young mind couldn't fully encompass it. It was like trying to comprehend the distance to a distant star. Intellectually graspable as a concept, but emotionally impossible to truly internalize. No, wait," Stanfield stammered, stepping back, his hands raised as if trying to physically push reality away. "He was resisting. He didn't tell me who he was. If he was a Fed, he should have flashed the badge at the window. This is on him. He baited me." "I am under no legal obligation," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Stanfield's spiraling protests like a surgical blade. To identify myself as a federal agent in order to avoid an unlawful arrest by a local municipal officer. The words were precise, measured, devastating. Your lack of probable cause was your choice, Officer Stanfield. Your immediate escalation to physical violence was your choice. Your decision to fabricate charges and file a false report. He paused. Also your choice. Marcus stepped closer to the counter, his presence suddenly filling the space in a way that made the booking area feel smaller, more confined. I did not bait you into anything. I simply existed in a public space doing nothing illegal, and you chose to demonstrate exactly who you are and how you operate. I didn't know, Stanfield pleaded, the words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. I couldn't have known. How was I supposed to? That, Marcus said, is precisely the point. The heavy wooden door to the precinct captain's office suddenly swung open with a bang that made everyone in the booking area jump. Police Captain Warren Blake stepped out, adjusting the tie of his pressed uniform shirt with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being in charge. He was a polished, politically savvy administrator in his late 50s, the kind of officer who spent more time cultivating relationships with city council members and local business leaders than he did walking the streets. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his uniform was crisply tailored, and his expression carried the mild irritation of someone whose afternoon had been disturbed by unnecessary noise. What is going on out here? Captain Blake demanded. Patterson, why is it so loud in the booking area? I'm on a conference call with the mayor's office. Patterson could not speak. His mouth opened but no words emerged. He could only point. A shaking, terrified finger directed first at the computer screen still displaying Marcus's federal credentials, and then at the man in the grey hoodie standing calmly at his booking counter. Blake marched over annoyed. He glanced at the monitor. He stopped walking. His jaw literally dropped. He looked at the screen, looked at the man in the faded grey hoodie standing calmly at his booking counter, and felt his stomach plummet into his shoes. Blake was a politician. He instantly recognized the apocalyptic magnitude of the situation. This was not a lawsuit that could be settled with a modest payout and a sealed agreement. This was not an internal affairs investigation that could be quietly managed with administrative leave and mandatory training. This was the kind of event that resulted in federal consent decrees imposed on entire departments. The kind of event that put precinct captains and police chiefs in federal prison. The kind of event that made careers disappear entirely, leaving behind only cautionary tales whispered in academy classrooms for generations to come. Captain Warren Blake felt his stomach plummet through the floor, through the foundation of the building, through the bedrock of Oregon itself, and continue falling into some endless abyss of professional catastrophe. Director Webb, Captain Blake said, his voice instantly transforming from irritation to panic-stricken supplication. He shoved Stanfield roughly out of the way, positioning himself between the disgraced officer and the federal executive as if physical proximity could somehow demonstrate good faith. Sir, my profound apologies. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding. A terrible lapse in judgment by a subordinate who clearly exceeded his authority. The words tumbled out in a desperate torrent, Blake's political instincts screaming at him to distance himself from the disaster as quickly as possible. Please let me get you a coffee. Come into my office. We'll sort this out immediately. Get everything wiped from the record. No paperwork, no arrest, nothing. You're free to go, of course. Right now. Immediately. He reached out as if to guide Marcus by the arm, desperate to extract this federal nightmare from his booking area before any more witnesses could observe the unfolding catastrophe. Marcus did not move. He looked down at Blake's outstretched hand with an expression of cold contempt that made the captain withdraw it hastily, as if he had accidentally reached toward an open flame. I'm not going anywhere, Captain Blake, Marcus said, his voice quiet but resonant with absolute authority. I have been formally detained. I have been physically assaulted. I have been handcuffed and transported against my will under threat of deadly force by an officer of this department. He paused, letting the weight of each word settle. Furthermore, Officer Stanfield has publicly and verbally initiated false charges against me in the presence of multiple witnesses. Marcus gestured toward the booking area, where a half-dozen officers and civilian employees stood frozen in various attitudes of shock and horror. These witnesses heard him accuse me of casing businesses resisting arrest and disorderly conduct, accusations that are demonstrably false and constitute criminal perjury. Sir, please, Blake begged, sweat beginning to bloom on his forehead. His carefully cultivated composure was cracking like thin ice under heavy weight. Let's handle this professionally between agencies. We don't need to involve outside authorities. We can manage this internally quietly in a way that... We are well past professional courtesy, Captain, Marcus interrupted. I did not identify myself as a federal official during the initial encounter because I wanted to observe how your officers treat the citizens of this community when they believe no one important is watching. The words landed like hammer blows. I wanted to see. Marcus continued. Whether the treatment I received was an aberration, a single bad actor making poor decisions under stress, or whether it represented something more fundamental about the culture you have cultivated in this department. He looked around the booking area, his gaze sweeping across the frozen offices, the humming computers, the institutional grey walls. Based on what I have observed in the past hour, I've drawn my conclusions. Captain Blake's face had gone the color of old paper. Sir? What are you saying? I am saying, Marcus replied, that I want the booking process completed. I want Officer Stanfield to put his fabricated narrative in writing under his signature under penalty of perjury. I want every detail of his false report documented in your official records. He pointed to the wooden bench in the holding area, a simple piece of institutional furniture designed for suspects awaiting processing. And then I'm going to sit on that bench and wait. Tyler Marsh, still slumped against the filing cabinet on the floor, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Wait for what? His voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the booking area, everyone heard him. Stanfield echoed the question, his voice shaking with terror. Wait for what? What's coming? Marcus checked the sleek analog watch on his wrist, a simple, elegant timepiece that somehow seemed incongruous on a man dressed in a faded hoodie, yet perfectly appropriate for a federal executive who commanded the attention of presidents. About 15 more minutes, Marcus said calmly. Then he walked over to the wooden bench, sat down with his hands resting on his knees, and closed his eyes. He did not explain further. He did not need to. The next 15 minutes were the longest of Derek Stanfield's life. He paced the length of the booking area like a caged animal, his boots scuffing against the linoleum in an irregular rhythm that grated on everyone's nerves. His mind raced through scenarios, justifications, excuses, anything that might somehow transform this nightmare into something survivable. He had been deceived. That was the angle. The man had deliberately hidden his identity, had dressed like a vagrant, had acted suspicious in a way that any reasonable officer would have investigated. It wasn't Stanfield's fault that the FBI sent high-ranking executives out on the streets dressed like criminals. It was entrapment. It was a setup. It was anything except the natural consequence of 16 years of unchecked abuse. But even as these desperate rationalizations churned through his brain, a deeper part of Stanfield, the part that understood despite all his bluster exactly what he was, knew the truth. He had done this to himself. Every time he had pulled over a vehicle because the driver didn't look right for a wealthy neighborhood, every time he had fabricated probable cause to justify an unconstitutional search, every time he had tightened handcuffs past the point of necessity, had shoved a suspect harder than protocol allowed, had filed a report that painted his victims as aggressors to justify his own violence. Every one of those instances had been building toward this moment, accumulating like interest on a debt that would eventually come due. The debt was due now. Captain Blake had retreated to his office, ostensibly to manage the situation, but in reality he was frantically making phone calls to the city attorney's office, to his own personal lawyer, to anyone who might offer some guidance on how to survive what was clearly about to become a career-ending catastrophe. Through his open door, the other officers could hear fragments of his increasingly desperate conversations. Yes, I understand the severity. No, I did not authorize. I need to speak with the chief immediately. This is a federal matter now. Sergeant Patterson sat behind his booking counter, staring at his computer screen without seeing it. His hands had stopped shaking, but only because they had gone numb. 23 years on the force, a pension waiting for him at the end of next year, a cabin in the mountains that he and his wife had been slowly fixing up for their retirement. All of it suddenly seemed very far away, very fragile, very likely to evaporate in the storm that was clearly approaching. Tyler Marsh remained on the floor by the filing cabinet, but he had pulled out his regulation notepad and was writing furiously. His handwriting was small, cramped, driven by an urgency that bordered on panic. He was documenting everything he could remember from the morning's events. Every word Stanfield had said, Every action he had taken, every moment where Tyler himself had failed to intervene, it was not loyalty to the truth that drove Tyler's pen. It was survival instinct. He understood with the clarity that fear sometimes provides, that his only chance of avoiding federal charges was absolute unvarnished cooperation. If investigators came asking questions, and they would come, he was now certain. Tyler needed to have answers, complete answers, answers that would establish him as a reluctant witness to misconduct, not an active participant. The pen scratched across the paper, filling page after page. Marcus Webb sat motionless on the wooden bench, his eyes closed, his posture relaxed but somehow still radiating an authority that made it impossible for anyone in the room to forget his presence. He might have been meditating, or sleeping, or simply waiting with the patience of a man who had learned to measure time in operations rather than minutes. The clock on the wall ticked, the water cooler gurgled, someone's phone buzzed with a text message, and the sound made 3 people flinch. And then from somewhere outside the building there came a new sound, a low, powerful vibration that resonated through the floorboards of the precinct. Not an earthquake, but something mechanical, something massive. The rumbling of high-output engines, multiple vehicles, approaching with synchronized precision. Stanfield stopped pacing. Patterson looked up from his screen. Captain Blake's voice, audible through his open office door, trailed off mid-sentence. Through the glass front doors of the precinct, the bright morning sunlight was suddenly blocked by enormous shadows. 4 massive shapes had materialized in the parking lot, their positioning deliberate, their presence overwhelming. "Oh, God," Stanfield breathed, backing away from the windows. Deputy Director Marcus Webb opened his eyes and rose from the bench with fluid grace. "That would be my colleagues," he said calmly. The 4 vehicles that had arrived were not ordinary SUVs. They were heavily armored Chevrolet Suburbans, finished in matte black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. They had no visible markings, no department names, no unit numbers, nothing that would identify them to a casual observer. But recessed into their grilles and windshields were small, intense lights that pulsed with red and blue urgency. And on their doors, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were small federal seals. These were FBI tactical response vehicles, the kind deployed for high-risk operations that required overwhelming force and precision execution. And they had just jumped the curb and parked in a tight V formation that completely blockaded the Ridgewood precinct's front entrance. As the officers inside watched in mounting horror, a 5th vehicle rumbled down the street from the opposite direction, a massive mobile command center truck, bristling with communications antennae and satellite uplinks. Painted the same matty black as the SUVs, it didn't park. It positioned itself directly across the precinct's rear exit, its bulk filling the narrow access road completely. There was no longer any avenue of escape from the Ridgewood Police Department. The building was surrounded. "What is this?" Stanfield's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "What the hell is this?" Marcus walked calmly toward the front windows, watching the scene unfold with the satisfaction of a chess master observing the final moves of a game that had been won many moves ago. "This, Officer Stanfield," Marcus said, "is what happens when you kidnap a federal executive." The doors of the black SUVs flew open in perfect unison, moving with the kind of practiced synchronization that spoke of countless training exercises and real-world deployments. Federal agents poured out. There were more than 20 of them, emerging from the vehicles with fluid efficiency and immediately taking up positions around the precinct's perimeter. They were clad in dark olive tactical gear, ceramic plate body armor emblazoned with massive yellow FBI lettering, load-bearing vests packed with equipment, tactical helmets with communication systems built in. They carried short-barreled rifles resting precisely on their slings, the weapons held in ready positions that were not quite aggressive, but not quite passive either. These were firearms handled by professionals who knew exactly how to use them, and hoped very much that they wouldn't need to. The agents moved with a terrifying silent efficiency that made the Ridgewood officers watching from inside the building feel like children playing dress-up. These were not suburban patrol officers who spent their days writing traffic tickets and responding to noise complaints. These were specialists, the kind of operators who had trained at Quantico, who had deployed on hostage rescues and counterterrorism operations, who had faced genuine threats and neutralized them with cold precision. Leading the formation was a tall, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes like cracked ice. He wore the same tactical gear as his team, but something in his bearing, the way he moved, the way the other agents deferred to his presence, marked him as the commander. Special Agent in Charge Victor Kane was the head of the FBI's Seattle field office, and he was extremely visibly angry. Kane's team approached the glass front doors of the Ridgewood precinct. They did not knock. They did not request entry. Two tactical agents simply stepped forward, raised a heavy breaching ram, and swung it against the door's lock mechanism with practiced precision. The doors exploded inward. Tempered safety glass showered across the lobby floor, scattering fragments that crunched underfoot as the federal agents flooded into the building. The sound was catastrophic, disorienting, a declaration that the normal rules no longer applied, that federal authority had arrived and would not be negotiating. FBI, the tactical commander's voice amplified by the enclosed space, crashed over the stunned Ridgewood officers like a wave. "Nobody move hands away from your weapons! Do not reach for anything!" The local cops complied instantly. Some raised their hands, veteran instincts overriding conscious thought. Others stepped back from their desks, creating distance between themselves and any equipment that might be misinterpreted as a threat. One officer who had been reaching for his radio froze with his hand in midair, afraid that even completing the motion might result in a ballistic response. Federal agents swept through the booking area with fluid precision, securing the perimeter, locking down exits, taking positions behind cover. Within seconds, every door was blocked, every window observed, every potential escape route eliminated. The Ridgewood Police Department was now under federal occupation. Agent Kane strode through the shattered doorway, glass fragments crunching beneath his tactical boots. His eyes swept the room once, cataloging faces, assessing threats, identifying the man he had come to find, and then locked onto Marcus Webb with visible relief. "Deputy Director," Kane said, his voice professional but carrying an undercurrent of personal concern. "Are you injured?" Marcus flexed his wrist slightly, displaying the angry red welts where Stanfield's handcuffs had bitten into his skin. "Minor contusions, nothing that requires medical attention." His voice was calm, measured, utterly in control. "However, you will want to ensure that Officer Stanfield's booking report is preserved exactly as filed. It contains multiple instances of perjury that will be relevant to the federal prosecution." Kane's eyes found Derek Stanfield, who had backed up against the far wall of the booking area, his face ashen, his body trembling visibly. The tactical commander who had led the breach was already moving towards Stanfield, two additional agents flanking him. "Officer Derek Stanfield," Kane announced, his voice carrying the formal cadence of an arrest notification. "You are being taken into federal custody for civil rights violations under color of law, assault on a federal officer, false imprisonment, and filing false reports. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "No," Stanfield stammered, his voice high and thin and completely stripped of its earlier arrogance. "No, you can't do this. This isn't right. He didn't tell me who he was. He baited me. I'm a police officer. You can't just..." "Additional charges," Kane continued as if Stanfield hadn't spoken, "may be added as the investigation proceeds. You will be transported to the Federal Detention Center in Portland for processing." The tactical agents reached Stanfield. One of them grasped his right arm firmly but professionally. The other produced a pair of handcuffs, federal handcuffs, heavier and more secure than the local issue that Stanfield had used on Marcus just an hour before. The metallic clicking sound as they ratcheted shut around Stanfield's thick wrists was the same sound that had echoed through the morning air when he had detained Marcus Webb. The symmetry was not lost on anyone in the room. "I want a lawyer," Stanfield babbled as the agents began to escort him toward the shattered front doors. "I have rights. You can't just do this without process. I want my union representative. Your union representative has no standing in federal proceedings," Kane interrupted flatly. "You will have access to legal counsel at the detention facility. Until then, I strongly recommend that you exercise your right to remain silent, as you are currently making our job significantly easier." Stanfield opened his mouth to protest further, but something in the cold professional eyes of the agents surrounding him caused the words to die in his throat. He was no longer the predator. He was the prey, caught in a trap of his own making, and the hunters who had come for him were far more capable than anyone he had ever faced. They marched him toward the door. Captain Warren Blake had emerged from his office during the chaos of the breach, his face a mask of barely contained panic. He stood behind his desk sergeant's counter, Watching the federal agents swarm through his precinct with the horrified expression of a man watching his life's work burn down around him. "Director Webb," Blake said, stepping forward as Stanfield was escorted past. His voice was desperate, placating, stripped of any pretense of authority. "Sir, I want to assure you that this department will cooperate fully with any investigation. Officer Stanfield was operating far outside his authority, and I had no knowledge of—" "Captain Blake," Agent Kane interrupted, turning to face the precinct commander. "You are not a witness in this matter. You are a subject." The blood drained from Blake's face. "Subject? What do you mean subject? I wasn't even there. I was in my office when all of this—" "When your officer was assaulting a federal executive, you were 3 rooms away," Marcus said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the ambient noise of the federal operation like a knife through silk. "When your desk sergeant was processing a fraudulent arrest report, you were on the phone with the mayor's office." He stepped closer. "When the citizens of this community were being terrorized by an officer with 14 prior complaints in his personnel file, you were cultivating political relationships and ignoring the cancer growing in your department." Marcus stepped closer to Blake, close enough that the captain could see the cold fury that burned behind the federal executive's calm exterior. "I have questions for you, Captain Blake. Questions about how an officer with Derek Stanfield's record remained employed for 16 years. Questions about how his complaints were handled, or more precisely, how they were buried. Questions about the culture of this department and the leadership decisions that allowed that culture to flourish." Blake's legs were visibly weakening. He grabbed the edge of the booking counter for support. "Director, I inherited many of these problems from my predecessor. The union contracts, the arbitration rules, the difficulty of terminating officers. You have to understand the constraints that—" "I understand constraints intimately," Marcus said. "I also understand accountability. Right now, I am uncertain which category you fall into, constraint or accountability. That determination will depend entirely on your cooperation in the coming hours." Agent Kane stepped forward. "Captain Blake, you are not currently being arrested. However, you are being placed on administrative leave pending the completion of our investigation. You will surrender your service weapon and department credentials. You will not enter any law enforcement facility without federal authorization. You will make yourself available for interview within 24 hours. Yes, of course, full cooperation." Blake fumbled with his holster, his hands shaking so badly that it took him 3 attempts to extract his weapon and place it on the counter. 2 agents approached to collect the items and escort Blake to a chair against the wall. Not handcuffed, not arrested, but clearly not free either. "Sergeant Patterson," Kane said, turning to the desk sergeant. "The same conditions apply to you. Administrative leave, surrender of credentials, availability for interview. We have significant questions about the booking procedures followed this morning." Patterson nodded weakly, his face the color of old newspaper. He had already removed his weapon and was in the process of unpinning his badge when Kane spoke. Another 30 years of his life represented by that piece of metal. And now it was going into a federal evidence bag. "Director," Kane said, turning back to Marcus, "we should probably debrief you privately. There's a secure area in the mobile command unit outside." Marcus shook his head slightly. "Not yet. I have one more matter to address." His eyes found Tyler Marsh. The young rookie was still slumped against the filing cabinet, his notepad clutched to his chest like a talisman, his face a portrait of utter devastation. He had watched the federal agents arrest his training officer, had watched his captain reduced to a trembling supplicant, had watched the entire structure of his professional world collapse around him in the span of minutes. Now the deputy director of the FBI's National Security Branch was walking toward him. Tyler tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He managed to struggle to his feet by bracing himself against the cabinet, standing at a position that was probably meant to be attention, but ended up looking more like a man trying not to fall down. "Officer Marsh," Marcus said. "Sir." Tyler's voice cracked on the single syllable. "Sir, I didn't touch you. I tried to tell him to stop. I documented everything. Every lie he told, every violation of procedure. It's all here." He held up the notepad like a shield, pages covered in his cramped, frantic handwriting. "Everything he said, everything he did, all of it." Marcus took the notepad gently from Tyler's trembling hands. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the meticulous, nervous handwriting that documented the morning's events from the perspective of a terrified witness. He looked back at Tyler. "You failed to intervene this morning, Officer Marsh." Tyler's face crumbled. I know, sir. You watched your training officer assault a citizen without cause. You watched him fabricate charges. You watched him file a false report, and you said nothing, did nothing, offered no resistance, no objection, no interference. I was scared of him, Tyler whispered. The culture here, if you speak up, if you go against another officer, they destroy you, they freeze you out, I'm aware of the dynamics, Marcus interrupted. His voice was stern, but something in it had shifted. Not softer exactly, but perhaps more nuanced. I have spent 30 years in federal law enforcement. I know exactly how toxic cultures perpetuate themselves, and I know exactly how much courage it takes for young officers to stand against them. He handed the notepad back to Tyler. Your documentation will be valuable to our investigation. Your testimony, if you choose to provide it, will be equally valuable. He paused. Agent Kane will be taking your statement. Be completely honest, omit nothing, embellish nothing. Your cooperation today, your genuine complete cooperation, will be a significant factor in determining whether you ever wear a uniform again. Tyler's eyes were wet, but he nodded vigorously. Yes, sir, I understand. Complete honesty. Everything. One more thing, Officer Marsh. Sir, Marcus stepped closer, dropping his voice so that only Tyler could hear. Fear is a natural human response to danger. Letting it dictate your duty is unacceptable, but it is also forgivable under certain circumstances. What is not forgivable is choosing fear permanently, making it your guiding principle, allowing it to transform you into someone who looks the other way when injustice occurs. He met Tyler's eyes directly. If you survive this investigation, if you choose to continue in law enforcement, I strongly suggest you find a department that values integrity over intimidation, a department where speaking up is rewarded rather than punished. They exist, Officer Marsh. They are rare, but they exist. I will, sir. Tyler said, his voice steadier now. Thank you, and I'm so sorry for all of it. I'm so sorry. Marcus nodded once, then turned away from the young officer and walked toward the center of the booking area. The precinct was in chaos around him. Controlled chaos, professional chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Federal agents were dismantling the Ridgewood Police Department's administrative infrastructure. Filing cabinets were being emptied into evidence boxes. Hard drives were being removed from computers for forensic imaging. Every piece of paper, every electronic record, every fragment of documentation was being catalogued for eventual analysis. Agent Kane approached Marcus with a tablet and a set of keys. Your rental vehicle has been secured, Director. Your sister called your encrypted line. We informed her that you were delayed by a minor traffic incident, but are on your way. Marcus allowed himself a small, genuine smile. Thank you, Victor. Excellent work today. We'll tear this place down to the studs, Director. Every complaint, every report, every disciplinary action. We'll find everything. I know you will. Marcus looked around the room one final time. The shattered glass doors, the stunned local officers sitting against the wall under federal supervision, the booking counter where his gold badge still rested. A silent testament to the catastrophic miscalculation that had brought all of this crashing down. Then he walked out through the shattered entrance, stepping over broken glass and into the morning sunlight. The fleet of black SUVs sat idling in the parking lot, their presence a stark reminder of the immense forces that had been mobilized. Beyond them, a local news van was pulling into the far corner of the lot. Someone had already tipped off the media, and within hours this small-town precinct would be national news. As Marcus walked toward his rental sedan, still parked at the coffee shop, guarded by a federal agent until he arrived. He passed the patrol cruiser where Derek Stanfield had been placed in the back seat. The disgraced officer was slumped against the plexiglass divider, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face wet with tears. He was staring at something outside the window. Not the agents, not the precinct, but the distant mountains. The everyday beauty of a world he would not be part of for a very long time. He looked up as Marcus passed. Their eyes met through the patrol car's window. And in that moment, Marcus saw something that almost approached recognition. Not understanding exactly, not acceptance, but the beginnings of a terrible awareness that the man Derek Stanfield had been for 44 years was no longer possible, and the man he was about to become would be defined entirely by this morning's catastrophic choices. Marcus did not nod, he did not speak, he simply continued walking. leaving the ruins of the Ridgewood Police Department behind him. But before Marcus reached his vehicle, he stopped. He turned back toward the precinct, where federal agents were still processing the scene, and made a decision. This moment needed to be documented, not for legal purposes. The evidence was overwhelming. The case against Stanfield and the department leadership was already ironclad, but for something else, for the record, for the people who would never know what had happened here unless someone spelled it out for them. Marcus walked back into the booking area, glass crunching beneath his shoes, and found Captain Blake still sitting against the wall under federal supervision. The captain looked up as Marcus approached, his face a mask of dread and desperate hope. "Director Webb, I want you to know that I will fully cooperate with—" "Answer one question for me, Captain," Marcus interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with undeniable authority. Blake nodded eagerly. "Anything. Whatever you need. If I had not been carrying federal credentials this morning, if I had been exactly what Officer Stanfield assumed I was, a middle-aged black man visiting family for a graduation, what would have happened to me?" The question hung in the air. Blake's mouth opened, but no words emerged. He knew the answer. Everyone in the room knew the answer, but saying it out loud would be an admission that went far beyond this single incident. Marcus waited. "You would have been—" Blake's voice trailed off. He tried again. "The charges would have been—" "I would have spent 48 hours in your holding cell," Marcus said, completing the thought that Blake could not. "I would have acquired a criminal record for fabricated charges. My niece would have missed her graduation because her uncle was in jail. And Officer Stanfield would have returned to duty, perhaps received a commendation for his proactive policing, and continued terrorizing the citizens of this community for years to come." He stepped closer to Blake. "How many people has that happened to, Captain? How many lives has your department destroyed? How many complaints have been buried? How many victims have gone home traumatized, convinced that the system offers them no recourse?" Blake couldn't answer. "That," Marcus said, "is what we are going to find out. And if the answers are what I suspect they are, you will have plenty of time in a federal facility to contemplate the consequences of your leadership decisions." He turned to address the room. The federal agents, the stunned Ridgewood officers, the administrative staff who had witnessed everything. Let me be clear about what happened here today. Officer Stanfield did not make a simple mistake. He did not misjudge a situation. He did exactly what he has been doing for 16 years. He identified a citizen he believed to be vulnerable, fabricated a justification for harassment, and exercised violence against someone he assumed had no power to fight back. Marcus's voice rose slightly, filling the space. The only thing that made today different was the identity of his victim. Every other aspect, the profiling, the lies, the violence, the fabrication, was standard operating procedure for this officer, and I suspect for this department. He looked directly at the recording devices that the federal agents had set up. "This is not about me. I will recover from a few bruised wrists and a missed cup of coffee. This is about the hundreds of citizens of this community who have experienced the same treatment and had no recourse. This is about the complaints that were buried, the patterns that were ignored, the leadership that chose statistics over civil rights." Marcus walked toward the shattered front doors. "Justice is not about revenge. It is about ensuring that what happened to me this morning never happens to someone who lacks the power to fight back." He stepped over the broken glass and into the sunlight. Behind him, the federal operation continued. Agents photographed evidence. Computers were disconnected and carried out in evidence bags. Officers who had looked the other way for years were now forced to confront the reality that had always existed beneath the surface. The Ridgewood Police Department, as it had existed for decades, was being dismantled piece by piece. And it had all started because one arrogant officer decided to harass a quiet man drinking coffee in a grey hoodie. Agent Kane caught up with Marcus as he was walking toward the command vehicle. "Director, there's something you should see." He handed Marcus a tablet displaying a case file. The header read, "Civil Rights Division, Preliminary Investigation, Ridgewood PD, Case number CRD-2024-0847. Marcus scanned the document, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Kane with something approaching grim satisfaction. "The investigation began 8 months ago," Kane confirmed. 3 federal civil rights complaints triggered the probe. We had been building the case slowly, gathering data, analyzing patterns, preparing for eventual intervention. And I was supposed to be observing from a distance during my visit. Marcus said, completing the thought. Background reconnaissance while attending my niece's graduation. Exactly, we had no intention of moving this quickly. The investigation was projected to take another 6 months at minimum. Marcus looked back at the precinct, where Derek Stanfield was now being transferred from the local patrol car to a federal transport vehicle. The disgraced officer's face was visible through the window. Vacant, stunned, utterly destroyed. Officer Stanfield decided to accelerate our timeline, Marcus said quietly. He didn't just assault a random federal executive, Kane said. He assaulted the lead investigator on his own department's case. The irony is almost too perfect. It's not irony, Marcus replied. It's inevitability. When an institution becomes corrupt enough, when the rot runs deep enough, the system eventually destroys itself. All it needs is a catalyst. He handed the tablet back to Kane. Today, Officer Stanfield was that catalyst. He spent 16 years building toward this moment. Every complaint he generated, every citizen he terrorized, every violation he committed, all of it was accumulating, waiting for the spark that would ignite the conflagration. Marcus looked toward the mountains in the distance, their peaks touched with late-season snow, their grandeur utterly indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. He could have driven past me this morning. He could have seen a man drinking coffee, shrugged and continued his patrol. Nothing forced him to stop. Nothing required him to escalate. He chose to do this because that is who he is. Fundamentally, at his core. And now he will live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. The case is ironclad, Kane said. With your testimony, the dashcam footage, Officer Marsh's documentation, Stanfield will never see the outside of a federal prison again. Good, Marcus said simply. He walked to his rental sedan, where a federal agent had been standing guard. The agent handed him the keys with a respectful nod. Director, are you sure you don't want an escort to your sister's residence given everything that's happened? No, Marcus said. Thank you, but no. I've taken enough time away from my family obligations. He unlocked the sedan and slid into the driver's seat. On the center console, his cup of coffee sat exactly where he had left it hours ago. Cold now, and probably bitter, but somehow satisfying nonetheless. He took a sip. The coffee tasted like victory. He started the engine, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the chaos of the Ridgewood precinct. In his rearview mirror, he watched the fleet of black SUVs, the shattered glass doors, the news vans that were now multiplying in the parking lot. Then he turned his attention to the road ahead. His niece was graduating tomorrow. He had a banner to hang and a gift to deliver. The quiet man in the grey hoodie had spoken, and the world had listened. The federal takeover of the Ridgewood Police Department was not a surgical procedure. It was a demolition. Over the next 72 hours, Agent Kane's team executed a comprehensive seizure of every document, every electronic record, every piece of physical evidence that might be relevant to the civil rights investigation. They interviewed every officer on the roster, from the most junior patrol deputy to the administrative staff who managed payroll. They subpoenaed phone records, email archives, personal financial statements. They obtained search warrants for the homes of Derek Stanfield, Captain Warren Blake, and 3 other officers whose complaint history suggested patterns of misconduct. What they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. The buried complaints against Stanfield were just the beginning. The investigation uncovered a culture of institutionalized abuse that permeated every level of the department. Officers routinely fabricated probable cause for stops in minority neighborhoods. Arrest quotas, officially denied but informally enforced, pressured patrol officers to generate statistics regardless of whether actual crimes had been committed. Complaint procedures were designed to discourage victims from following through, with forms that required multiple notarized signatures and deadlines that were nearly impossible to meet. Captain Blake, it turned out, had not merely been negligent. He had been complicit. Emails recovered from his personal account showed explicit instructions to subordinates about how to handle sensitive complaints, how to delay investigations until complainants gave up, how to word disciplinary findings to minimize accountability, how to protect officers whose behavior might attract outside scrutiny. The police union had been equally involved, providing legal defense not just for officers accused of misconduct, but for officers who were caught lying about their misconduct. Union funds had been used to hire private investigators to dig up damaging information on complainants, discrediting victims before their cases could gain traction. The Assert was comprehensive, coordinated, and deliberate. The news coverage was relentless. What had started as a local story about a federal executive being wrongfully arrested quickly expanded into a national conversation about police accountability and civil rights. News networks sent crews to Ridgewood. Investigative journalists began connecting the dots between Stanfield's conduct and similar patterns in departments across the country. The phrase Ridgewood scandal became shorthand for everything that could go wrong when law enforcement operates without genuine oversight. And at the center of it all, facing the full weight of federal prosecution, was Derek Stanfield. The detention facility in Portland was a stark contrast to the comfortable precinct where Stanfield had spent his career. The walls were concrete, not drywall. The lights were harsh and institutional, not the soft office-style fluorescence he was accustomed to. The sounds were different, the distant clanging of metal doors, the echo of footsteps on hard floors, the constant low murmur of other detainees. Stanfield was processed like every other federal prisoner. He was photographed, fingerprinted, searched, and issued an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. The uniform he had worn with such pride for 16 years had been replaced by the uniform of a criminal. He was placed in a single occupancy cell, ostensibly for his own protection. Former law enforcement officers did not fare well in general population, and left to contemplate the wreckage of his life. In those first hours of isolation, Stanfield cycled through every stage of grief with manic intensity. Denial came first. This was all a mistake, a misunderstanding, a temporary setback that would be resolved once someone realized he was actually the victim here. Then anger at Marcus Webb for baiting him, at the FBI for overreacting, at his colleagues for failing to defend him. Then bargaining. Maybe if he cooperated. Maybe if he testified against Blake and the union leadership. Maybe if he claimed that he had been following orders, that the culture of the department had forced him to behave this way. But deep down, in the darkness of his cell, Stanfield knew the truth. He had done this to himself. Every traffic stop where he had let prejudice guide his judgment. Every interaction where he had escalated instead of de-escalating. Every lie he had told. Every report he had falsified. Every citizen he had terrorized because he knew they couldn't fight back. All of it had been building toward this moment. The walls of his cell seemed to press inward as the weight of that realization settled over him. The federal charges were devastating in their scope. Derek Stanfield was indicted on 8 separate counts. Civil rights violations under color of law, assault on a federal officer, false imprisonment, filing false reports, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights, obstruction of justice, perjury, and abuse of authority. Each count carried significant prison time. Together, they represented a sentence that would consume whatever remained of his adult life. Captain Warren Blake faced his own set of charges: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, failure to supervise, and accessory to civil rights violations. The emails recovered from his personal account were particularly damning, explicit evidence that he had knowingly enabled misconduct rather than merely failing to prevent it. Sergeant Roy Patterson was charged with accessory violations and obstruction. His role in processing the fraudulent arrest of Marcus Webb, combined with evidence of similar processing decisions over his long career, established a pattern that prosecutors had no trouble demonstrating. 3 additional officers were indicted on lesser charges related to their own conduct and their cooperation in covering for colleagues. The union president, who had personally intervened in multiple complaint investigations, was charged with conspiracy and fraud. The dominoes were falling, one after another, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. 6 months after the morning on Elmwood Avenue, the federal trial began in the United States District Court in Seattle. The gallery was packed every day. Journalists, civil rights advocates, family members of the accused, curious citizens who wanted to witness history being made. Television cameras were stationed outside the courthouse, capturing every arrival and departure, every dramatic moment that escaped the sealed proceedings. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the dashcam footage from Stanfield's patrol car, showing every moment of the unlawful stop. They played the audio recordings from Marcus Webb's phone call to Washington, demonstrating that he had reported the incident while it was still occurring. They introduced Tyler Marsh's handwritten documentation, his testimony on the stand corroborating every detail of the prosecution's narrative. They presented statistics showing the patterns of discriminatory enforcement, which neighborhoods were targeted, which demographics were stopped most frequently, how complaints were handled versus how they were officially reported. They called witnesses, citizens of Ridgewood who had experienced similar treatment over the years, but had never believed their complaints would be taken seriously. One by one, they told their stories, the humiliation, the fear, the sense that the system offered them no recourse. The defense tried everything. They claimed that Stanfield had been following departmental training. They argued that Marcus Webb had deliberately provoked the encounter. They suggested that the federal investigation had been politically motivated, designed to target conservative law enforcement. None of it worked. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing day arrived on a cold December morning, 6 months and 14 days after Derek Stanfield had handcuffed a quiet man drinking coffee on Elmwood Avenue. Federal Judge Samuel Morrison presided over a courtroom that was silent except for the scratch of sketch artists' pencils and the soft breathing of spectators who understood they were witnessing something significant. Derek Stanfield sat at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist, his ankles linked by a short length of restraining metal. He had lost weight during his months in detention, and his buzz cut had grown out into something unkempt and graying. He looked like what he had become, a broken man waiting to learn how many years of his life would be spent behind bars. Judge Morrison reviewed the case one final time, his voice grave and measured. "Officer Derek Stanfield," the judge began, "you were entrusted with one of the most profound responsibilities our society bestows upon any citizen, the authority to enforce law, to protect the innocent, to maintain peace within your community. You betrayed that trust deliberately and with apparent pleasure." He paused, letting the words settle. "You did not make a single mistake. You made hundreds of them over 16 years, and each one represented a choice to prioritize your ego over your oath, your prejudices over your duties, your desire for dominance over the rights of the citizens you were sworn to protect." The judge's voice hardened. "The morning you arrested Deputy Director Marcus Webb was not an aberration. It was, as the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates, standard operating procedure for you. The only thing that made that morning different was the identity of your victim. Every other aspect, the profiling, the lies, the violence, the fabrication, was simply who you are." He looked directly at Stanfield. "You have shown no genuine remorse. Your defense in this trial consisted of blaming others, denying obvious facts, and attempting to paint yourself as the victim of some conspiracy. I have seen no evidence that you understand, even now, the magnitude of the harm you have caused." Judge Morrison opened a folder and read from a prepared statement. "On count 1 deprivation of civil rights under color of law, I sentence you to 8 years. On count 2, assault on a federal officer, I sentence you to 6 years. On count 3, false imprisonment, I sentence you to 4 years. The sentences accumulated, stacking one upon another like bricks in a wall. These sentences will be served consecutively," the judge concluded. "The total term of imprisonment is 14 years in a federal correctional facility, with no possibility of parole." 14 years. Stanfield would be 58 years old when he was released, if he survived that long. Former law enforcement officers in federal prison were not treated kindly by their fellow inmates, and 14 years was a long time to watch your back. As the federal marshals rose to escort him from the courtroom, Stanfield finally looked up. His eyes found the gallery, scanning the faces until they settled on one, Deputy Director Marcus Webb, who had attended the sentencing in civilian clothes. Seated quietly in the back row, their eyes met. Marcus offered no expression of triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication. He simply looked back at the man who had changed the trajectory of multiple lives on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and then he looked away. The marshals took hold of Stanfield's arms and led him toward the side door that connected to the prisoner transport area. His legs barely seemed to support him. His head hung forward. Whatever defiance he had once possessed was gone, replaced by the hollow shell of a man confronting the full weight of his choices. The door closed behind him. The gallery erupted in subdued murmurs. Justice had been served. Captain Warren Blake received 6 years for his role in enabling the department's culture of abuse. The evidence against him had been damning, not just the emails showing explicit instructions to bury complaints, but testimony from officers who described the pressure they had felt to generate statistics regardless of legal justification. Blake had created the environment in which someone like Stanfield could thrive, and he would pay for it with years of his life. Sergeant Roy Patterson received 2 years for his role in the conspiracy. His decades of not seeing had finally caught up with him, and the retirement cabin in the mountains would have to wait. The Union president received 4 years for his coordination of the cover-up efforts. The Ridgewood Police Department itself was formally disbanded. Its duties were absorbed by the county sheriff's office under a federal consent decree that mandated independent oversight. Mandatory body cameras, comprehensive training on civil rights law, and immediate reporting of all citizen complaints to a civilian review board. The consent decree would remain in effect for a minimum of 10 years, with federal monitors empowered to extend it indefinitely if compliance was insufficient. For the citizens of Ridgewood who had lived under the department's corrupt rule for decades, the consent decree represented something they had never dared to hope for: genuine accountability. The Ridgewood scandal, as it came to be known, reverberated far beyond the borders of a single Oregon town. Investigative journalists empowered by the precedent the case had set began examining similar patterns in departments across the country. The federal government, under pressure from civil rights organizations, announced expanded oversight initiatives for local law enforcement. In the months following the trial, 17 additional departments nationwide came under federal investigation for civil rights violations. The domino effect that Deputy Director Marcus Webb had set in motion continued spreading, toppling corrupt structures that had stood unchallenged for decades. Officer Tyler Marsh provided crucial testimony throughout the proceedings, his detailed documentation corroborating every element of the prosecution's case. When the trials concluded, he made a decision that surprised no one who had watched his transformation. He resigned from law enforcement. Using his savings and a modest scholarship, Tyler enrolled in law school. Determined to become a civil rights attorney, he had seen from the inside how easily power could be corrupted, and how desperately communities needed advocates who understood the mechanisms of that corruption. He would spend the rest of his career fighting on the other side, representing the citizens that officers like Derek Stanfield had victimized. It was perhaps the only form of redemption available to him. Deputy Director Marcus Webb returned to Washington after his niece's graduation. The ceremony had proceeded exactly as planned. Destiny walking across the stage in her cap and gown, Marcus cheering embarrassingly loud from the audience, Patricia rolling her eyes while secretly recording everything on her phone. The congratulations banner had been hung. The leather journal had been unwrapped. For a few precious hours, Marcus had been Uncle Marcus instead of the deputy director. And those hours had been worth more than any federal operation. Now, months later, he sat in his secure office overlooking the capital city. On a muted television mounted on the wall, a news segment played footage of Derek Stanfield being escorted in shackles to a federal transport vehicle. The crawler at the bottom of the screen read, "Ridgewood Scandal. Former officer begins 14-year sentence." Marcus did not smile. He did not celebrate. For him, this had never been about revenge. The bruises on his wrists had healed within days. The inconvenience of the missed coffee had been trivial in the grand scheme of his life. But the principle mattered. The principle that no one, not a patrol officer, not a precinct captain, not a department or a union or an entire culture of impunity, was above the law. The principle that justice, while sometimes slow and often imperfect, could still assert itself when the evidence was undeniable and the will to pursue it was present. Marcus picked up his coffee cup, black no sugar, brewed from beans that his assistant had sourced from some small batch roaster in Seattle, and took a slow sip. Then he turned his attention to the stack of briefings on his desk. National security matters that required his attention. Threats that needed to be assessed and neutralized. The world kept turning. Evil did not take vacation days, and Deputy Director Marcus Webb had work to do. 3 months after the sentencing, on an ordinary Tuesday morning not unlike the one that had started everything, Marcus Webb found himself once again in a rental car in the Pacific Northwest. This time he had come to deliver another gift to his niece, a collection of books he had carefully selected for her first semester of college. Patricia had suggested they meet at a coffee shop near the university, and Marcus had agreed without hesitation. He parked along the curb outside the shop, cut the engine, and reached for his cup of coffee, purchased from the counter just minutes before. Still warm, exactly the way he liked it. As he sat there savoring the quiet moment, a police cruiser rolled past on the street. It was a county sheriff's vehicle. The Ridgewood Police Department no longer existed. The deputy behind the wheel glanced at the man in the rental car, noted nothing unusual, and continued on his way. No lights activated, no horn blared, no aggressive officer emerged to demand identification. Just a patrol car passing a citizen, both going about their business, the way it was supposed to work. Marcus watched the cruiser disappear around the corner. He thought about Derek Stanfield, sitting in a federal prison cell somewhere, contemplating 14 years of consequences. He thought about Tyler Marsh, probably studying for a contracts exam at some law school library, building toward a new purpose. He thought about all the citizens of Ridgewood who could now drive through their own town without wondering if they would be harassed for existing while different. Change was possible. It was slow, painful, and often required someone to pay an unjust price before the injustice was recognized. But it was possible. Marcus finished his coffee, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the shop where his sister and niece were waiting. The quiet man in the grey hoodie had spoken once, and the world had listened. Now it was someone else's turn. If you felt the justice in this story, if you believe that accountability matters and that no one should be above the law, we appreciate your support in sharing these powerful narratives. Please subscribe to our channel for more dramatic stories of truth, courage, and the moment when karma finally catches up with those who abuse their power. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Thank you for watching, and remember, true authority comes not from a badge or a uniform, but from integrity, accountability, and the courage to do what is right.